Well, we have finished our study of the end times. I did a 12-part deep dive into end times prophecies, starting with Daniel and ending in Revelation. But this video is meant to be a recap of the whole study. It is not further teaching. It is not elaboration of anything that was already covered in the lessons. Instead, this should be just a short summary of the takeaways from that study. So I'm not going to be doing any teaching. I'm not going to be sharing scripture. I'm not going to be sharing my screen. Instead, I just want to walk through the final timeline that we established by synthesizing and harmonizing all of the prophecies related to Jesus's second coming, Armageddon, Judgment Day, and ultimately the new heavens and new earth and our eternal place, our eternal state. So I want to walk through that with you. And what I'm going to do along the way is point out which lesson that particular aspect of the timeline was addressed. So if you missed anything, or if you want to go back and re-listen to the deeper teaching about that particular part of the timeline, you'll know which lesson to dive into. So I hope that makes sense, and I'm eager to share this with you because, man, we put in a lot of time and a lot of effort to compile this timeline so that we can be awake and ready as the bride of Christ, that we can be prepared for what is coming so that we're not led astray and our love does not grow cold and we don't fall for the great deception that is about to unveil itself upon the world, but also that we can stay inspired to be on mission, that we can be sharing the gospel, that we can be bringing more people to salvation in Christ so that they themselves can be walking out this faith journey with us as brothers and sisters. So, with all that being said, let's dive into it. Okay, so we have a timeline that is based off of a final 7 year period, which comes from Daniel chapter 9. I break that all down in the second lesson, but he had a prophecy of 70 weeks, or some translations will say 70 sevens, because it's not weeks, it's actually periods of 7 years. So we break that all down, and of the 70 weeks, or the 70 periods of 7 years, 69 have already happened. We are waiting for that last quote unquote week, or that last 7 year period. So the timeline is based off of that there are certain things that have already happened. There are more things that are to come before we enter into that final 7 years. And then there are things that we know happen at the midpoint of those 7 years, as well as at the end of those 7 years. So I just wanted you to be aware of my reference to the final 7 years, or the Daniel's last week or final week, because that is a major framework for our timeline. I also want you to know that the same story is told from Genesis to Revelation. And in fact, when Adam and Eve fall and are put out of the garden in Genesis 3, there is what is known as the proto-evangelium, meaning it is the proto first evangelium, evangelism, which really means gospel message. So that means that what we see fulfilled in Christ's first coming and then ultimately finished in his second coming was told to humanity at the beginning. It was also told to Satan, the serpent, at the beginning as well. And that's found in Genesis 3:15, where God himself prophesies that the seed of the woman, who is Jesus, would crush the head of the seed of the serpent, and the serpent is Satan, his seed is the Antichrist. And that initiates what many call the seed war, or the war between the seed of the woman, which is Jesus, and the seed of the serpent, which is like the Antichrist and the enemy. And you can learn more about that in my series on Elohim and Nephilim. That has its own playlist on my YouTube channel. But that kicks off this whole process, right? And God says that He has told us the end from the beginning. And that's exactly right. Genesis 3:15. He told us the end from the beginning. And in fact, that seed war is what explains what ultimately happens in Genesis 6 with the Nephilim, leading to the flood in Genesis 9. And Jesus says, when He talks about the end of days at the Olivet Discourse, He said it's going to be like the days of Noah. So that's why it's also important to go back to lesson 1, where I talk about all of this, because Jesus is giving that reference and He expects us to have some insight into what it means. Now, I believe it means multiple things. Like, some people look at that and say, oh, it's just going to be surprising. It's going to be like Jesus said, when He comes, one person will be left in the field and one will be taken, which we refer to as the rapture, because when it came time for the flood, you had Noah and his family on the ark, but for the rest of the world, the rest of humanity, it was surprise, right? And Jesus says He's going to come like a thief in the night. So I do agree with that. That is certainly an aspect of it, of the end of days being like the days of Noah, but I think there's more to it as well. For example, we know that and in the days of Noah, that evil kept increasing until that ultimate destruction and judgment came. And I believe that that's what we're seeing happen now. Evil's going to continue to increase until destruction, that final judgment comes. And in fact, in 2 Peter 3, he says that then the world was destroyed by water, but now it's going to be destroyed by fire. So even in 2 Peter 3, he compares the two, just like Jesus did. So we need to understand even the things from Genesis in order to make sense of the descriptions, the comparisons, the metaphors that are shared in other prophecies in the New Testament. Okay, so it is going to feel like a surprise to many. In lesson 1, I also talk about the Tower of Babel, in which Nimrod rises up. He leads humans to attempt to become their own gods by building a tower and a city. Now, the tower represents a religious system, and the city represents a governmental system. And what I believe is that we have been living through iterations of this event ever since. That over and over again, Nimrod, an antichrist figure, this somebody rises up in the spirit of Nimrod. And what do they always do? They always try to implement one world government and a one world religion. And we see that in the end times prophecies as well. The final Antichrist, the final Nimrod, is going to do the same thing. Establish a one world government, which many of us call the New World Order or the Cabal, right? And he's also going to establish a one world religious system. So you will have people who talk about end times prophecies that are known as preterists. And what that means is those are people who believe that certain prophecies, including the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25, that those describe things that have already happened. Okay, and so therefore they've already been fulfilled, they've already happened, so they don't apply to coming events. I believe it's yes and. So some of the prophecies, when you read them, it seems like some were fulfilled. For example, the destruction of the temple by Rome in 70 AD. I believe there are certain things that Jesus describes in the Olivet Discourse that apply to that. But guess what? Even though it's already happened, it's going to happen again. And that gets laid out real clearly in Daniel 11, where you get to see over and over empire after empire rise up. We see, and I cover that in lesson 3, we see that in the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had of the statue, where Daniel interprets it, right, and goes through and says it's empire after empire. So yes, it's happened, but guess what? It's going to happen again, and it's going to keep happening until we have the final Antichrist, because we know that God has been putting roadblocks. He has put it down. He has not allowed things to come before the proper time. And so, as I just mentioned, like that vision that Nebuchadnezzar had that Daniel interprets, I cover that in lesson 1. The head of gold is Babylon. It's Nebuchadnezzar himself. But what the prophecy then foretells is that there will be a chest and arms of silver that'll come after him. That was Mede Persia. Then middle and thighs of bronze, which was Greece, the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. Then you have the legs of iron, which is Rome and the Roman Empire, which was in power during the New Testament. Well, then you have the feet, which is a mix of iron and clay. Well, the iron would still be Rome, but the clay means something else was mixed into it. And that's the Holy Roman Empire, which was established in 800 with Charlemagne being crowned the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Well, then you go down to the 10 toes on those feet, still a mixture of iron and clay, and that is the revival of the Holy Roman Empire, which is the European Union. And it says the 10 toes represent 10 kings who've not yet come to power. Well, we see that same thing about 10 kings in the visions of the beasts, both in Daniel 7, where it shows up as four distinct beasts, or in Revelation 13, where it shows up as one composite beast, but it has 10 horns. And we're told that in both of places, Old Testament, New Testament, that those 10 horns again represent 10 kings who are going to come to power. Those 10 kings, that coalition, is going to be the one world government. That's going to be the New World Order. They're going to come out of the European Union. So we know that from those 10 kings, 10 horns, that's where the Antichrist will ultimately rise to power. That he's a little horn that when he rises to power displaces three other horns. Okay. And so that's going to be something to watch for in the middle of Daniel's final week, that final 7 year period. So I go over the beasts in lesson 2, and I talk about how what Daniel saw in his time compares to what John saw as far as end times vision, and how the different parts represent nations that will be in existence in the end of days. So, for example, the lion that had eagle's wings that were plucked off, well, that's the UK, that's the British Empire. Then you have the bear with three ribs in its mouth, that's Russia. Then you have the leopard with four heads, but also the wings of a fowl. Well, the leopard itself is Germany, and France is the rooster. So there's been a lot of things where we've seen relationship between Germany and France, including the establishment of the European Union, which I believe is the fourth head. So when we look at these prophecies, we can see how the spirit of Nimrod is going to continue to rise up, establish a one world government, attempt to establish a one world religion until we get to the final iteration. And I believe that we're in the final iteration. I believe that we're waiting for the ultimate fulfillment of all these prophecies. And that's why it's important for us to be aware of what they are, so that as we're watching things transpire, be reported in the news, that we are hearing these rumors, we're seeing these things happen, that we're not afraid. We're also not surprised, that instead we are prepared. So, out of this union of, we saw the British Empire, then the Russian Empire, and then we've seen the German Empire with Hitler being the Third Reich, the third head, and now the European Union being the fourth head. Well, what's next? It's the 10 horns. Okay, so that's what we need to be prepared for, is those 10 horns, knowing that from among them, that's where the Antichrist will rise up. He's referred to as the abomination of desolation. Even in Matthew 24, that's what Jesus calls him, that beware of the abomination of desolation, who's going to rise up, just like Daniel said. And Jesus expects us to understand that reference. There's even in parentheses, let the reader understand. So that's why the first 3 lessons go through Daniel, because when we get to lesson 4, where we dive into what did Jesus say about the end times, we have an understanding of all the references that he is making, both explicitly, like that abomination of desolation as Daniel foretold, as well as other things that line up with that prophecy, so that when we then go into Revelation, we can see how Revelation ends up being a fulfillment of all those things. So it's in lesson 3 that we did an investigation into the Antichrist, and we dive into the historical events of Daniel 11, as well as Daniel 11 and 12 about the future, and all of that prepares us for lesson 4, where we go through the Olivet Discourse. And that is our primary framework for the rest of our study, as well as for our overall timeline. And we use the Olivet Discourse to confirm what we see foretold as well as fulfilled. Now, in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus is asked 3 questions. He answers those questions, and he answers them chronologically. So what I'm going to do as we go through the timeline is I'll keep coming back to Matthew 24 and 25 because I want to go through the full timeline, and Jesus talks about the fulfillment of prophecy in a chronological order as well. Now, the first question he's asked, when will these things be? See, he had just been talking about the destruction of the temple, which means tearing down their current religious system. He answers that first question in Matthew 24, verses 4 through 14. The second question is, what will be the sign of his coming, his return? He answers that in Matthew 24:15 through 25:30. The final question is, what will be the sign of the close of the age? He answers that in Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. Okay, so that's what we're going to be revisiting as we go through our timeline. Okay, so like I said, we're waiting for the start of those final 7 years, but there are certain things that have already happened or that will happen before that final 7 years is started. Now, the things that he talks about in answering that first question, those are all pre-final 7 years events. So things like many will come claiming to be the Christ, many and they'll lead many astray. We'll hear of wars, rumors of wars, famines, pestilence, great earthquakes. In Luke 21, which is also a rendering of the Olivet Discourse, it adds that we'll also hear about the terrors and great signs from heaven. But he warns us that's just the beginning of the birth pains. Now, hasn't this already been happening? We've already been seeing that happen. So we're in and have been in the beginning of birth pains. He also talks about how there will be a tribulation for believers. This is different from the great tribulation, which the Antichrist will bring about, because the church has been in tribulation since its inception. Okay, so what does Jesus mean? He says, people are going to hate you for my sake. Check, right? We've seen that. We've seen that for 2,000 years. They're going to be betrayed. They're going to be handed over. There's going to be false prophets that are going to arise. We're going to see lawlessness increase. We're going to see the love of many grow cold. However, despite those things, the gospel is going to continue to advance and ultimately be spread throughout the world. And that's exactly what we've seen for the last 2,000 years is despite persecution, despite tribulation, despite the efforts of man to put down Christianity and the spread of the gospel, God is more powerful than that. And the gospel has continued to be spread around the world. And so we need to be praying for those who are on mission, who are spreading that gospel, because that is one of the triggers for Jesus coming back. We also see some about the pre-final 7 years in the beginning of his answer to the second question. What will be the sign of his coming? So halfway through him answering, okay, here are the signs that my coming is imminent, right? That I'm about to show up. Right in the middle of that, he uses the illustration of the fig tree. And in Luke's account, it says fig tree and all the trees. In Matthew's account, it just says fig tree. And he uses that saying, just like you see the fig tree and all the trees come to leaf in the spring as a sign that summer is coming, that is going to be for us the generation that will not die before he comes back. So I talk about this in the what, fourth lesson? The fourth lesson. Yes. Okay. I talk about this in the fourth lesson where we are looking at those trees. Okay. Well, the fig tree is Israel, and Israel was formed as a nation in 1948. But what about the other nations, the other quote unquote trees? Well, Saudi Arabia, its symbol is the date palm, and it was formed in 1932. Lebanon is the cedar. It was formed in 1943. Syria is the olive tree, and it was also formed in 1943. Jordan is the palm tree, and it was formed in 1946. And then, as I said, Israel's the fig tree. It was formed in 1948. So when we look at these trees that were established right, that were planted, then when do they come into leaf? Because that is going to be the generation that will not die out before Jesus comes back. Well, what's the length of a generation? Well, in Psalm 90, it says 70 to 80 years is the length of a generation. However, Jesus said it's going to be like the days of Noah. And in Genesis 6, God limited the lifespan of a man to 120 years. So when we look at that and we say, okay, have these trees come into leaf? And if so, then that's the fig tree generation. And Jesus is going to come back within potentially 120 years of that moment. So that's something that Jesus responds with that also would start, it would initiate before those final 7 years. We read this, we also learn about this in 2 Peter 3. There's different events that he describes, and I read 2 Peter 3 in lesson 1. I read it again in lesson 5. I read it again at toward the end because there's just so much in there. But it says that in the years leading up to the final 7 years, there will be scoffers questioning, why is it taking Jesus so long to come back, right? Trying to sow doubt and confusion. He also warns there are going to be those who are ignorant and unstable, who are going to twist scriptures, twist prophecies. So just like Jesus warned, false teachers, false prophets, false Christs, false gospels. We've been seeing that, okay? And I don't know about you, but it feels like I've been seeing more and more of it. And so that, again, all of that seems to point to the fact that we're just getting closer and closer to those final 7 years, because all the things that Jesus said, all the things that the apostles wrote about, all the things that Daniel said, it's like we can just go check, check, check. Okay. All those things have been happening and are happening. And so it just seems like we're getting so close to those final 7 years and Jesus's return. Now, in lesson 8, I talk about the 7 trumpets that we find in Revelation. And I present what I believe is a compelling case that the first 5 trumpets have already blown. Okay. And so that means that the first 5 trumpets happened before the start of the final 7 years. The next event that we're waiting for is the 6th trumpet, which is going to be a war that many believe will be dubbed World War III. Now, it's unclear if that's going to happen before the start of the final 7 years or at the beginning of the final 7 years. So that particular event is not a trigger for the start of the final 7 years. However, it's the next trumpet to be blown. Now, the final trumpet is going to be the one that announces Jesus's return. It's at that final trumpet that he calls his bride to himself, that the dead will rise, and those of us who are alive when that happens, it's at that final trumpet. Well, that's the 7th trumpet. And also, the 7th trumpet is when Jesus comes back. It also is where we see the 7 bowls of wrath are going to be poured out. So I do believe that our study revealed a post tribulation or post great tribulation, pre God's wrath rapture of the church or ingathering of the church. Okay. Now, something to also be aware of in Revelation, it's not written chronologically in the sense that you can start Revelation 1 and go all the way through the end and everything's told that happens in order. People get confused if they think that way. Instead, Revelation tells the same story multiple times. I believe it's 4 times, but we see it specifically in the telling of the trumpets, the seals, the bowls of God's wrath, that all of those things culminate in Jesus's return. Okay. So, like I said, it's not the 6th trumpet war, even though that's the next event that is in the timeline of the trumpets that we're waiting for. That doesn't trigger the final 7 years. Instead, it's something that's discussed in Daniel 9, where it says that there will be a peace agreement that will allow the religious Jews to rebuild an altar and temple and resume animal sacrifices. So we cover the Daniel 9 part in lesson 2, but in later lessons, I talk more about the Temple Mount and resuming animal sacrifices and all of that. So that's definitely something we talk about more than once, but I break down this initial trigger in lesson 2 because we know that that's going to start the final 7 years. Other events that may happen at the start of the final 7 years would be Israel being protected for 3.5 years by the wings of an eagle. So If the lion had eagle's wings that were plucked off, that would clearly be the United Kingdom, with the United States being the eagle's wings, and we were plucked off because we got independence. So, could these eagle wings that we see in Revelation 12 also be the United States? Quite possibly, and I cover that in lesson 9. So, lesson 9, I go into Revelation 12. I talk about the Jewish remnant, the 144,000. I talk about how Israel will be protected for 3.5 years. Now, that could be the first half of the final 7 years, or it could be 3.5 years leading up to the final 7 years. I don't know. Or it could be, just kind of somewhere in that beginning. Now we know it has to be before the midpoint when the Antichrist rises up and puts an end to the animal sacrifices and initiates the Great Tribulation. So it has to be before that point. So it could be now, it could be soon, it could be the first half of the final 7 years. We also learn in the same lesson about the two witnesses, which I believe are going to be believers coming in the spirit of Moses and the spirit of Elijah, and they're going to testify about Jesus. And it says for 3.5 years. Now, I believe that that's also the first 3.5 years, the first half of those final 7 years, because when the Antichrist rises to power, he's going to kill them, and he rises to power halfway through that Daniel's final week. So I believe that those are two other things that will probably happen either like leading up to or in that first half. It seems to make sense that the United States would come to Israel's support in establishing an altar and resuming animal sacrifices and kind of protecting that at the same time that you have the two witnesses and the Jewish remnant who are preaching the gospel, and then the Antichrist finally rises up to power and puts an end to all that. Okay. I also believe that the first four seals are open during the first 3.5 years, because the first four seals are the four horsemen. Okay. And they're not allowed to act until the 144,000, the Jewish remnant, are sealed. And we know that happens before the Great Tribulation, which is what the Antichrist, when he rises to power, he starts. And we talk all about the seals in lesson 7. Also in lesson 7, I explain who are the seven spirits of God, who are the elders in the throne room, who are the four living creatures, or what are the four living creatures, as well as who are or what are the four horsemen, which are the first four seals. Now, I believe the four horsemen represent judgments that will be unleashed upon the corrupt systems of this world, with the white horse representing the Catholic Church, or maybe the corrupted church, the red horse representing communism or socialism, the black horse representing capitalism, and the pale or green horse representing Islam. So, like I said, I break all that down in lesson 7. So, I believe that also happens in the first 3.5 years, the first half of Daniel's final week. Okay. So, hope you're tracking with me. We're waiting for the sixth trumpet war. We're waiting for the peace agreement where the religious Jews will be able to resume, build an altar, build a temple, and resume animal sacrifices. We are waiting for whatever the source of protection is. I believe it's going to be the United States, the eagle's wings, that are going to play a role in that. We're also then going to have the two witnesses who are going to be there in the spirit of Moses and Elijah. We'll probably see the four seals, the first four seals open. The four horsemen comes. We'll see judgment coming upon the world systems. So all of that is leading up to the rise of the Antichrist. Okay, we know from Daniel 9 that the Antichrist will rise to power and put an end to the animal sacrifices halfway through that final week. Okay. So that's why we know that the religious Jews have to resume the animal sacrifices first, because that's not currently a thing. They have to get permission. They have to rebuild all that. And like I said before, the Antichrist is described as a little horn that when it rises up amongst the 10 horns, which is the one world government, the New World Order, that it's going to uproot 3 horns in its way in order to do that. So I'm not sure what that'll end up looking like, but it'll be very clear that we'll go from some kind of coalition government to a singular person who rises to power. And we know that this rise to power is the activity of Satan, and it'll be accompanied with false signs and wonders and wicked deception. Okay, so I talk about all that in lessons 2 and 3. Now, later in lesson 5, I go into the writings of the apostles in the New Testament, including the letters from Paul, in which he describes the Antichrist as the man of lawlessness or the son of perdition. So I explain all that in lesson 5. Lesson 4, again, it's the Olivet Discourse, in which Jesus describes him as the abomination of desolation prophesied by Daniel. So between Daniel, Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, and the prophecies of the apostles in the letters, the latter part of the New Testament, we know several things about what the Antichrist will do when he finally rises to power. The first, he's going to stand in the holy place, or he'll take his seat in the new temple. That's kind of how it's described. So he'll either stand there or take his seat there, which means there has to be a temple for him to do that. There currently isn't one. He's going to speak haughty and blasphemous words against God. He's going to exalt himself above all other gods and ultimately proclaim himself to either be God or to be Messiah. And based off of different things that we learned along the way, I believe he's going to present himself to be the Messiah of basically the major world religions, because the Jews are still waiting for the Messiah because they don't embrace Jesus as the Messiah. The Christians are waiting for Jesus to come back for the return of their Messiah. So are the Muslims. They're also waiting for the return of a particular imam that's supposed to be a messianic figure. I believe the Antichrist is going to basically go into this new temple that they're going to build. He's going to put an end to the animal sacrifices because it's not needed anymore, because he's the Messiah and he's there and he's going to lead many astray. And that is going to be the unification of the major world religions under the Antichrist, who's going to claim to be the Messiah for all of them. And he will be supported by the false prophet, who's going to cheer all that on and support all of that. Okay. So we know all of this happens at that 3.5 year mark. Okay. We also know that he will make war on the saints and will prevail until Jesus returns. That's the time that Jesus calls the Great Tribulation, which is the fifth seal being opened, after which we see a great multitude of martyrs come into heaven in the book of Revelation. So for more information about the Antichrist, the rise of the Antichrist, watch lessons 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. So as I said, we'll keep returning to the Olivet Discourse because as we go through the timeline, different things that Jesus shares in that discourse, it's all chronological and it all fits into our timeline. And one of the things he said is, when we see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the Antichrist or the beast, stand in the holy place, that he says those who are in Judea, which today is known as the West Bank, should flee because the Great Tribulation is about to begin. And in this time, the Great Tribulation, there will be false Christs, false prophets. They're going to perform false signs and wonders. And that includes the false prophet, which I believe is going to be the Pope. And they're attempting to lead many astray, including the elect, which means the elect has to be here. Okay. So that's why we don't believe in a pre-tribulation or mid-tribulation rapture. We believe in a post-tribulation, pre-God's wrath rapture. Okay, so let's talk more about that great tribulation. Believers will be delivered up for persecution. Some will be put to death. We're going to be betrayed and hated by many, leading many to fall away, unfortunately. But guess what? We need to remember this is an opportunity for us to bear witness to Jesus, to not deny him before man, okay? To stand firm. And as Jesus says, he who endures to the end will be saved. So we need to be committed in our mind. Right now, we're not going to take the mark of the beast. We're not going to deny Christ before man. We're going to instead bear witness, stay true to our witness, stay true to our testimony, and we're going to endure to the end. Okay? Because unfortunately, we're going to see a lot of people who claim to be Christians not do that. They're going to compromise. They're going to fall away. They're going to be led astray. And unfortunately, they're going to be led astray by the false prophet, who in Revelation 13 says he looks like a lamb, but he speaks like the dragon. Okay, so I believe that's going to be the Pope, and I explain all of that in lesson 9. So if you want my breakdown of the false prophet and the Catholic Church and all of that, definitely rewatch lesson 9. But the false prophet will arise, perform signs and wonders. He's going to tell the world to worship the Antichrist. He's going to promote a device that will monitor and enforce worship of the Antichrist. He's going to tell everyone to take the mark of the beast. And I give all of my theories about technology, what that might look like again in lesson 9. Now, here's the good news. Many will purify themselves and be clothed in white. That's who we need to be amongst that group. Okay. The remnant that stays true, that keeps our wedding garment on, keeps our wedding garment clean. We purify ourselves. We are the pure bride waiting for our groom. But unfortunately, the wicked shall act wickedly and they'll have no understanding. Okay. So we need to be prepared for that. Also, in the Olivet Discourse, in answering the second question, Jesus says that immediately after the Great Tribulation, okay, is when he comes back. Okay, so that, and he even says the Great Tribulation is cut short for the sake of the elect. Again, we're here for it. Okay, we're here for it. But immediately after the Great Tribulation, the sun and moon will go dark, stars will fall from heaven, powers of heaven will be shaken, the oceans roar, people will faint from with fear of what was coming upon the earth. All of that describes the sixth seal being opened. Okay, so the Olivet Discourse is talked about in lesson 4. The seals are talked about in lesson 7. So if you want to see that correspondence of the events that Jesus said is going to happen in lesson 4, and then their fulfillment in John, what John sees in this great in the seven seals, that's going to be lesson 7. There we go. All right. So again, we believe in a post tribulation, pre God's wrath rapture, because the 7 bowls, or some translation call it the 7 vials of God's wrath, those are going to be poured out upon those who take the mark of the beast. We are raptured before that. Okay. So for those who take the mark of the beast, these bowls of God's wrath, I believe, happen very quickly. And the final bowl being is the treading of the winepress of God's wrath, which is what Jesus does at Armageddon. Okay, so I teach on the bowls of wrath in lesson 10, and I teach on Armageddon in lesson 11. Okay, so let's talk about Jesus's return. That's the good news for us, right? And Jesus's return is actually the culmination of many, many prophecies. Okay, so Jesus says he's going to return on the clouds. Paul describes it as well as the clouds, but then when we see it described by John, he describes it as a white horse. I think it's the same thing. But he's going to be descending in the air from the third heaven with power and great glory. He's going to come as lightning filling the sky. And multiple places we see it described like a thief in the night, right? So he's going to show up, and the sky, let's just say it's at night, right? But it'll light up like it's daytime, like lightning. It's going to fill the sky. Okay. And Jesus, when he comes, the first thing he's going to do is going to send out his angels with a loud trumpet. That's the 7th trumpet. He's going to gather his elect, which I believe is the first reaping. In Revelation 14, there's 2 reapings. That's the first reaping. And this is where we have the separation of the wheat from the tares. So he's going to, with that loud trumpet, he's going to gather his elect. That's the first reaping of the righteous. That's the gathering of the wheat. And he says that it's going to be, that we're going to be delivered before God's wrath is poured out. And of this reaping, of this rapture, okay, which I know many say the rapture is not in the Bible. It is. Rapture comes from rapturo, which is the Latin Vulgate, for harpazo, which is the Greek of the original, which just means gathered. Okay, so the rapture just means the ingathering, being caught up. Okay, and we know that those who are dead in Christ will come back with him. They'll be resurrected. Okay, the dead shall rise first. The righteous who are alive at the time will be caught up, rapturo, raptured, in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Paul says we'll be transformed in the twinkling of an eye into our heavenly bodies, which are spiritual and perishable. We bear the image of Christ. We shall be like him. This is the revealing of the sons of God that Paul wrote about in Romans. This is also the marriage of the Lamb, okay, which is in Revelation 19. I address all these things kind of throughout many lessons, but ultimately I pull them all together in lesson 11. So you'll see if you go through the whole study, I'll talk about these different things at different points, but I bring them all together in lesson 11 when we talk about Jesus's return, his gathering of his bride, the marriage of the Lamb. And the very next thing that happens is he goes into battle, because the Antichrist, the beast, and the false prophet, they've gathered the peoples, the nations together to make war, okay, against the Lord. So that's the very next thing he does. And he takes us with him And this is the start of the day of the Lord. Okay. I talk about the day of the Lord in lesson 5 and how it starts with his coming and Armageddon. It ends with Judgment Day. Okay. There's 1,000 years in between, and I'm going to get to that. But I just wanted you to know um, that we do believe in a premillennial reign, that Jesus will come back, and that starts the day of the Lord, which I go into detail in lesson 5. So the Antichrist comes into Israel, the glorious land. He has an army. He has the false prophet. They pitch their tents between the sea and Mount Zion. Jerusalem is surrounded by enemies. They're setting up for Armageddon. Okay. And I explained in lesson 11 how this is the Gog of Magog war in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Don't be confused by people who are out there saying that the Gog of Magog war is imminent, because they're confusing the sixth trumpet war with Armageddon. So I explain all of that in lesson 11. Armageddon is the seventh seal being opened. Okay, so we've had the the seven trumpets, because the seventh trumpet is Jesus coming back. We've had six of the bowls, with the seventh bowl being this moment, and we've had six of the seals, with the seventh seal being this moment. Okay, and so that means that there's going to be thunder, lightning. This is a great earthquake. We find out that Jesus will set foot on the Mount of Olives, which breaks the city into pieces. His saints and his angels are with him. There's 100-pound hail. Okay. In this moment is where we have the judgment of the counterfeit church, which is the harlot or mystery Babylon. Okay. In lesson 11, I describe how it's judged and destroyed, but in lesson 9, I explain who it is. Okay. So lesson 9, we explain who it is. Lesson 11, we see the judgment. Also in lesson 11, we find that the beast, the Antichrist, is destroyed with fire, or killed with the breath of Jesus's mouth at the appearance of his coming. He and the false prophet, basically what all that means is they're thrown into the lake of fire. We also learned that those aligned with the Antichrist are all killed, but Satan, the dragon, he's not killed in this moment. He's bound in the abyss for 1,000 years. That's the millennial kingdom. That's the millennial reign. And I cover all of that in lesson 12, the final lesson. Now, it's unclear what happens with Israel after Armageddon. Ezekiel 39, Romans 11, they both indicate that there's some kind of final redemption opportunity where all of Israel will be saved. I don't know if that happens then or if that happens during the millennial reign. That part's unclear. But we do know that there are survivors of Armageddon, because there are those who are not saints at Jesus is coming. All the saints are raptured and already transformed into their glorified state. We know that there are those who aren't raptured, so they weren't saints, but also not everybody else is going to take the mark. So you're going to have this third group of people who weren't saints, but also didn't take the mark and therefore weren't killed at Armageddon. So there will be mortals alive during that millennial reign. And these mortals are commanded to keep the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, every year during the millennial kingdom. But it's during that millennial reign, we also all live in a state of peace with Jesus as our king. There's no more human governments. There's no more nations. There's also no more Satan, because he's bound during this time. However, at the end of that period, Satan is released from the abyss. He goes out to deceive all the mortals on the earth. Basically, he's redoing Gog and Magog. Okay. He's going back through it again. He's trying it again. So he does do it again. He's able to build up an army again. They march over the broad plain. They surround the beloved city in which the raptured saints dwell with Jesus. But fire comes down from heaven, consumes those armies. That's when Satan is finally thrown into the lake of fire, the same lake of fire where the false prophet and the Antichrist already are. And that's what then brings us to Judgment Day, the end of the day of the Lord. And lesson 12, I explain how it's all one day. It's just one day that lasts 1,000 years. So make sure you check that out in lesson 12. So on Judgment Day, Jesus takes his seat on the great white throne of judgment. The dead are resurrected. That's the second resurrection. We want to be a part of the first resurrection. And all people, both the resurrected dead and the mortals on earth who didn't fall for Satan's second attempt, they weren't part of that final army, they're all going to be judged according to what they've done. So it talks about how there's books of their deeds, as well as the book of life. And each person's work is going to be revealed and tested by fire. This is the separation of the sheep from the goats. So this is when Jesus answers the third question within the Olivet Discourse. So I explain all that again in lesson 12. Now, at the end of judgment, the unrighteous are thrown into the lake of fire. Death and hell are thrown into the lake of fire, and that fulfills the prophecy that the last enemy to be destroyed is going to be death. Okay. So, like I said, Jesus talks about the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25:31 to 46. That's judgment day. That's this moment. It's at the end of the day of the Lord, the end of the millennial kingdom. And this is answering the question about what's the sign of the close of the age. So that's what he's saying. Judgment day will be the end of the day of the Lord. It'll be the close of this age. Why? Because immediately after judgment day, then we have the new heavens and new earth established. So that's the close of the age, because now it's going to be a return to Eden. But it'll be a new and better Eden, because it'll be a new heavens, a new earth, a new Jerusalem. And that's where the righteous will dwell with Jesus for all of eternity. And I close up lesson 12 talking about eternity and what it'll be like for us. In eternity, there's no more death, no pain, no sadness, and no fear. We will exist fully immersed in God's presence, which means all that is loving and good. We'll have new bodies with new senses. We'll eat, we'll drink. There'll be a new earth, but it'll have a different set of physics. There's not going to be any more physical sun. When we talk about like gravity and light and heat and time, all that's going to be different because there's not going to be a physical sun anymore. Instead, Jesus will be the source of our light. There's going to be no more marriage because there's no more need for procreation because the earth has already been populated. Paul talks about how now we only know in part, but then, meaning in our eternal state, our final state, will know fully and will also be fully known. We know that we will be with God and the angels and the other saints. And we also know that we'll worship and serve God. That's going to be our eternal state. So that's what we're all looking for. That's what we're all preparing for, is not just Jesus coming back and being raptured, but also recognizing that there are many things that will come even after that moment, and just to be aware of it. Even though if we're in that first resurrection, we're good, we're already in our glorified state, but we don't want to be a part of the group that is still mortal. We also don't want to die before Jesus returns and die not knowing him, because those are the ones who will be subject to judgment day, who will be judged on that day. Whereas we who are in the first resurrection are not subject to the lake of fire. We're not subject to that second death. And like I said, I cover all of that in lesson 12. So I know that was fast. It was meant to be fast. And I hope that that also helps you to get a clear picture, although a very quick picture, of the end times prophetic timeline, as well as some guidance into which lessons to go and view or to revisit if you've already watched them, in order to get more detailed teaching. So in each of the lessons, I read the scripture with you. I walk through the connections. I dive deep into certain things that are either alluded to or addressed at the different points in different prophecies. So I don't want you to rely solely upon this video. I want to encourage you, if you have not gone through all 12 lessons, do so. But I hope this was helpful in giving you a recap, as well as giving you insight into what was covered in each of the specific 12 lessons. So thank you for being a part of this with me. It was definitely a labor of love, and I'm just so excited to have shared this with you. And I hope that all of this encourages us. Paul tells us to remind each other of Jesus' coming as a means of encouragement, but also to prepare us so that we're awake, we're ready, we're on mission. We're going to be those 5 virgins who have enough oil. We're going to be the ones who are ready for our king, for our groom to show up. We're going to be the bride that has her wedding garments on. That's my prayer for all of you. So thank you for being with me. Thank you for going through all of this. And I hope that you explore other lessons, other teachings on my YouTube channel. This will definitely not be the last that you will hear from me, but it's certainly the last that you'll hear from me about this particular topic.